Hi, I'm Alex. Welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking about the 6 books and, by extension, writers that made me want to be a writer. I grew up with a parent who was very much into reading and introduced me to books and stories at a very young age. And all of these things sort of impacted me. But thinking back, there were distinctly books that made me go, I want to create like that. The first book I'm going to that really said, hey, guess what? This is pretty cool, was Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. And I think everyone at this point knows the story, has read it, has watched it, has been involved in that story. That was a story that I was utterly obsessed with, still kind of am, was when I was very young. And I don't even remember when I got it. For Christmas one year, my mother got me a faux leather illustrated copy of Alice. This thing was like, it was a big book, and it had the pictures, and it had gold leaf on the front, and it was gorgeous. I carried this book everywhere and had it up until 2 years ago when my book collection was lost and destroyed. I had this thing my entire life, and I would go back and I'd reread it, and as a kid I'd be like, hey mom, let's read Alice. And while I am aware that technically Alice was created as I believe the story goes that it was created as a rebuttal to the idea of imaginary numbers or something like that, the story itself created this world that was so imaginary. We all know the world of Alice, and it just, for me, it was like, oh, he literally created a world where almost nothing was impossible. And while at the time I didn't go, oh, I want to be a writer, it was a story I was so obsessed with that later on, when I got into writing, the first thing I reached to was, oh, let's create a variant of this story. Let's create a variant of this character. It always had an influence of and the other thing is, I love the fact that it was an ordinary girl going into a completely insane situation. And it never really got the better of her. While there were moments she was lost and confused, she came out of that arguably a stronger person for it. And I think sometimes you can definitely see that come through in some of the stories I write. The second book, and these aren't in any particular order, just in case you were wondering. The second book is The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. Another one that we all know. I read this book pretty early, like maybe middle school, slightly younger, not sure. I took 2 days to read it, maybe? I know I was given it around lunchtime and just continued to read it. Like, I spent all night reading it, fell asleep for a couple hours, went to school, came back, was reading it again. Tolkien, and then later on as I read Lord of the Rings, but The Hobbit was my first introduction to Tolkien. Tolkien's world was something I kind of envied isn't the word I'm looking for, but I wanted to create worlds like that. I wanted to be able to create such expansive, even reading The Hobbit, where it was a very narrow focus on Bilbo and his story, you knew there were other things going on in the world, and that this world was far, far larger than anything you were reading in the book. You knew there was so much more to it. And I wanted to be able to create worlds like that. And this is actually when I read this book is actually around the time I started writing. I wanted, and still do in many respects, I want to be able to create a world where even though you're only seeing a part of it, you know and can get the feel of something so much larger. I don't know how to do that. To be honest, I don't. I don't know how he did it. The fact that this man created maps and a language, and there is so much that went into those stories, and I don't even have the first clue how he did it. The third book I want to talk about is actually not a singular book, but a series of books, which went... It's the Last Vampire series by Christopher Pike, which now goes under a different title and was printed as a 3-book collection, I believe, that goes by the title of Thirst, but I knew it as The Last Vampire. I read this series in high school, I believe. I have a terrible memory, so take timing as a grain of salt. Christopher Pike, if you haven't read any of his stuff, you really should. A lot of what he does, I believe, is YA. I honestly am not sure. The Last Vampire series took me off guard. Teenager, it was an easy... It wasn't what I would call a difficult book series to read. The sentence structures were simple. They were straight to the point. There was nothing complicated, in my opinion. What made it so shocking to me was this was the first time I had read anything that was graphically violent. And I think within the first... I'll even generously say the first half of the first book in the series. Obviously the book is about this vampire named Sita. I could be saying it wrong. I'm not particularly sure. But within the first half of the book, she kills someone and crushes their skull into the wall. And he describes it vividly. I read this and I was like, what did I just read? And that continues through all of the books. I had never picked up something that did not shy away from violence and the realities of what the life of someone capable of doing those things could be. In one of the books, it talks about when Sita was human, and the first vampire was a demon that had been summoned into the dead body of one of her friends who was pregnant. And the demon went into her baby. The graphicness of his description was amazing. And it just, while it shocked me, it also was like, oh, so you can combine fantasy and this really violent sort of, it just changed the way I viewed writing and what could be done. This is a thing you can do. Now, I'm not one to get into graphic things generally, although I am currently working on something that does involve violence, because I'm not generally comfortable with a lot of violence, but the way Christopher Pike did it, while I kind of went, I can hear those sounds in my head and I don't like it, I wasn't uncomfortable reading it. So in a lot of ways, he just kind of showed me that it was possible to write and read something that maybe in reality I wouldn't be comfortable with, but do it in a way that, it sounds awful to say, but in a way that I'm okay with. If you haven't read any of Christopher Pike, even as an adult, I really do. If you're into major sci-fi and twisty, turny, head thinking, like seriously deep thinking about the way things are, read The Starlight Crystal. It's a standalone book. It's brilliant. If I had a copy of it still, I'd be reading it now. The next book that had a distinct influence on me was, again, another series, The Incarnations of Immortality by Piers Anthony. If you're on the older side, you might know Piers Anthony. He did a lot of books. A lot. I found my first Incarnations book in my elementary school library. It might have been middle school. Not entirely sure. I found the third book, I believe it's the third book. Again, I'd have to double check, but I found Being a Green Mother, which was about Mother Nature. Now, the thing about Piers Anthony is he always makes you think. The Incarnations were about what if things like war, death, time, nature, fate were just jobs that people filled the roles of. Now, first off, that was a major thinker for me. Because I went, wait, so any of us could be death or God or Satan. Those were also jobs that were filled in by people. They weren't. Piers Anthony is another one who, while he describes things and makes sure you get a thought in your head of what's going on, he doesn't over describe. He's not a Tolkien in the terms of that. But what really affected me about those books was he introduces a lot of concepts at once and then proceeds to explain it as he goes. So that while in the beginning you're like, okay, but what about? By the end, you have a lot of those answers, but you're still left thinking about things you read along the way. And for me, that sort of writing where in the end you're like, okay, I feel like I have a complete story. Now I need to sit back and think about these concepts. A very specific example was in On a Pale Horse. Death is presented with 7 ways of thinking through matchsticks. It went through this big complicated thing and he ended up having to use it in his fight. But it was an interesting concept that I literally then spent days discussing. I'm sure people got tired of hearing me talk about it. But the idea of writing a book that for days and days afterwards, you could be discussing a single topic in it. It's something that, it's something that I would find fascinating to try and do, but I don't yet know that I could do something like that as organically as he did. And that's the thing. Piers Anthony was brilliant at discussing these complicated things, and it never feels like it's a contrived way of getting information across. And that's something, even if I'm not discussing difficult topics, I think that's a really smart thing to do within stories, is any information you need to put in should be put in very organically. And I think that's something I specifically very much struggle with. And even now, I think if I went back and reread some of those stories, I'd probably learn a little bit more about how to do that. Next book. Dragons of Autumn Twilight by Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman. If you're a D&D fan, you know this book, I'm sure. This is part of the Dragonlance series. It's part of a series of books. I actually got it as a compilation of 3 books together. But this falls back into that epic fiction sort of thing. I read it in middle school. I did reports on it. I was all over this book. This thing was this thick because it had 3 books, and I took it everywhere with me. I mean, everywhere. And again, I think that book attributed to a lot of the fact that I write mostly fiction. A lot of the books, and I think you've noticed pretty much all the books I read are fiction, and it's just that's where I feel drawn to, and a lot of these books just lended to drawing me to fiction. Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman were very good at writing characters. They were very good at making you feel emotional. Something that I feel I lack in a lot of my stories right now is the emotional connection that they were very good at writing. They were very good at writing relationships, both platonic and non. I think reading that book, a series of books, if you want to get technical, it was the Chronicles or Dragon Chronicles, something like that. If you look up Dragons of Autumn Twilight, it just says what it was a part of. It was just the first book, and then it went Dragons of Winter or something. It went through all the seasons. But I wanted to create things. And that's the big thing about it is that book made me want to create, because when I was reading that book, I was starting to write. I was trying to write long fiction, but it wasn't really working, which is why I went into poetry. But even there, when I wrote poetry, you could see the little sprinkling hints of that fantasy element that I was picking up from the book. And the final book, which I'm going to breeze through because my poor phone's about to give up the ghost, is The Andalite Chronicles by K.A. Applegate. Now, I know, by now we all know, she wasn't a person, it was a bunch of ghostwriters. Let's look past that. To date, that book is one of my favorite books. Not only does it jump between multiple, extremely, and I mean extremely different worlds, and deals with multiple different beings, aliens, humans, bunch of them. The characterizations going on are brilliant. I'm not just saying that as someone who apparently really likes centaur aliens that are psychic. Or not psychic, but telepathic, that's the word. There was so much going on in that book that was amazing. The sheer concepts of some of the things going on in that book were just mind-blowing. Which makes me really curious of how I would love to know who actually wrote that. Because if they wrote anything else, I'd love to read what they wrote. But it was probably one of the first books that I read that really not only took place in vastly, vastly different places, basically said, hey, you can literally jump between planets and people and make it work. They don't have to have some interaction beyond, oh, hey, by the way, these guys are enemies when they fight in space. Go figure. Anyway, those are the books that really, because of the concepts they introduced and the techniques and the way they did it, really just influenced my own writing and what I write about. If there are any books that influenced you as a writer, let me know in the comments. And I will see you all in my next video. Bye!